Hello, my name's John Rowan and welcome to aset channel. In today's class we're going to talk about the past. We're going to talk about decades in the past. A decade is 10 years. So we have a way of talking about 10 years in English. So if you look at the first example here, 1960s. So 1960s means from 1960 to 1969, those 10 years, one decade. So we're going to talk about different decades. So let's take a look at the first example. In the 1960s, I was a child. So I was born in 1963. So from 1963 to 1969, I was a child. I was a baby, and then I was, at the end of the 1960s, I was 7 years old. So we have the 1960s. We can also say the 60s, that's natural as well. Both are okay. In the 1960s I was a child, in the 60s I was a child. Both are okay. Our second example. In the 1970s I started to like rock music. So at that time I was starting to get a little bit older. So around about the middle part of the 1970s I was becoming a teenager. I liked music. Started to like rock bands like The Who and the Rolling Stones. So in the 1970s I started to like rock music. In the 70s I started to like rock music. In the 1980s I was a driving instructor. So one of my first jobs was to be a driving instructor. For 7 years during the 1980s I was a driving instructor. I taught people in my hometown Birmingham how to drive cars and how to ride motorcycles. So again, in the 1980s, or we can also say in the 80s. In the 1990s, I studied hard. So I went to university as a mature student. That means a student who goes to university at an older age. So when I was 30, at the beginning of the 1990s, I went to university and I studied hard so that I could come here to Japan to teach. And again, we could just say the 90s. In the 90s, I studied hard. So these are all examples about different decades. None of the examples about my history, what I did. But it could be other things. It doesn't have to be connected to you. In the 1960s, there was a man on the moon. America sent a rocket to the moon, and I think maybe 2 or 3 astronauts walked on the moon in the 1960s. In the 1970s, there was lots of very good music. In the 1980s, there was some not so good music, I think. In the 1990s, there were lots of interesting fashion. So you can talk about any subject about that decade. But please remember, both are okay. In the 1960s, in the 60s. In the 1990s, in the 90s. So, thank you very much for watching aset channel today. My name is John Rowan. See you next time.